Out of all the Cosmere, my biggest obsession is Mistborn. I spend hours a week thinking about Scadrial. I must have reread Era 1 at least 16 times. And it's only just recently that I've started to understand what I really think Ruin's prison was. It's never really spelled out anywhere. Kelsier tries once, and all Fuzz says is, that's not how it works at all. But I've been piecing together things from all across the different books and everything we know about the Cosmere, and I think I'm finally ready to explain what Leras did at the Well of Ascension to trap Ati's mind, and maybe what Ati would have done if he'd gotten the trust. Class is in session.
Do, 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 do.
This video will contain spoilers for Mistborn Era 1, including Secret History Mistborn. Part of the confusion is that the best explanation we get is the epigraphs of the Hero of Ages, where it's not all that clear. I'm not saying that as a criticism of Brandon. I think he wrote exactly what he wanted to write, but he was writing from someone brand new to deity trying to explain metaphysics to essentially a street urchin. So it's not really all that confusing that it's confusing. It does mean that we, the readers, have to piece together things a little bit more. So what exactly did preservation do? What does it mean to imprison Ruin? In this case, it means restraining the vessel. What preservation did was to sacrifice his own mind to create a prison that would keep Ati, the vessel of Ruin, away from the power. This left the Shard of Ruin undirected. This is a little different from other examples we see in the Cosmere, where a vessel has been killed or separated from its power, and the power is off to be splintered or pick up a new host. The Shard was never in danger of any of those things. Ati at all times was the full, complete, and total Shard of Ruin. He was the vessel. He just couldn't put his hands on the controls, and that meant that the Shard was on autopilot. Now, because Leras, the vessel of preservation, sacrificed his mind to do this, that meant that preservation was in the same boat. He left behind nothing but Fuzz, the shadow of self, to keep the Shard going, more or less on the same autopilot that Ruin was on. And that was fine, because the powers on their own are opposites. All they'll do when one tries to affect the world is to push back against it. If Ruin tries to ruin something, it'll be like a magnet. Preservation will swoop in, the two powers will repel each other, and they'll go back to normal. Same if preservation tries to preserve something beyond its time. Ruin will do the same. So the end result will be equilibrium. The object in question will have to ruin or preserve itself as it was going to anyway. But there's the rub of it, equal. Because some of you may recall, at this point, the two shards weren't equal. So why exactly did the prison work? Even without Ati, Ruin should have been strong enough to push preservation away more of the time. So why didn't it? Well, for that answer, we have to turn to atium, and why Ruin was obsessed with finding it once he was freed. Sazed describes it as his body, his power, but that's a little confusing because we see that Ruin does have power anyway. So what exactly did the atium represent? Let's start at the very beginning, 10,000 years ago at the shattering of Adonalsium. Ruin and preservation both came to this star system together, freshly shattered, totally equal, both shards of Adonalsium. Together, they were able to create a planet that they could watch over. But neither of them were satisfied. Nothing was being ruined because preservation's power was keeping everything in stasis, but there was nothing on it worth preserving since nothing of any real interest was there. Leras wanted people, but Ruin wasn't going to let him have a group of people that would grow and thrive and that he'd never be able to ruin. So that's where the compromise came in. Leras put part of his own power into the humanity of Scadrial. We're not completely sure how this works. It seems to be a little different from how it generally does. Across the Cosmere, we see examples of shards splintering themselves in ways that don't deny them access to that power. But for some reason, when Leras did it on Scadrial, it actually weakened him. So now we have the full power of Ruin with only the partial power of preservation. That was their promise, that was their compromise, and that was the ultimate doom of humanity. Because the overpowered Ruin would now slowly one day be able to destroy the entire planet because preservation simply wasn't strong enough to stop him anymore. But Leras had a different plan. Let's call it Plan B. The key to it was separating the mind of Ati from the power of Ruin. But we're going to put that in the cadmium bubble for now, because even if he accomplishes that, we still have the issue that the power of Ruin is stronger than the power of preservation. So what Preservation did, we're not really sure how, is that he chopped off a section of Ruin's power and made some mechanism at Ruin's well that would cause it to manifest as atium, or more specifically, geodes of atium, but that is a whole different can of worms we're not even getting into. Now, what was it equal to? It was equal to the amount of power that Preservation put into humanity. That left the remaining power of Ruin and Preservation once again equally matched, with the atium out of Ruin's direct reach. We don't know a lot about this part. How exactly was the power separated? How was it kept away from Ruin? We know that by burning it, the power was not given back to Ruin or put it any place he could access. We know that the Kolos had to show up in order for Ruin to metabolize it and get all the power back. At one point, Sazed had a bunch of Khandra trapped in the Trust Warren, but they weren't able to do whatever it was Ruin needed to do. Maybe the presence of too much metal in the caves was blinding Ruin, and they would have needed to physically take the atium out and bring it out into the open where Ruin could access it. Maybe there's some difference between Khandra and Kolos that we don't understand, and for some reason Kolos being there would have been different than Khandra being there. Anyway, that accounts for how the twin powers were equal once more, but remember what we put in that cadmium bubble before, we have to get back to the mind prison. What Leras did was to sacrifice his mind to create a prison for Ati. Kelsier says that he thinks it's like Ati was in a bottle, and the well was the cork that was holding him inside. But Fuzz tells us that's completely wrong. Which actually brings us back to Fuzz. Keep in mind, Leras had to sacrifice most of his mind. The only thing that was left was the shadow of self, Fuzz. The important thing you have to remember is, Leras died that day, thousands of years ago, when he first set up this whole Hero of Ages thing to happen over and over again. Fuzz is not Leras. He is just an echo, a remembrance of the god that once was. But even the echo of a god can last for thousands of years before finally fading. What I believe happened is, Leras sacrificed his own mind and used it to create a cage to trap the consciousness of Ati away from the power of Ruin. Now, we know these two forces are inimical to each other. Remember, that's eventually how Vin eventually kills Ati, is by forcing their minds together and they annihilate each other. This shows that the forces of Ruin and Preservation are inherently inimical to each other, which spawns a completely other wild theory that I will get into one of these days. For now, all we need to know is that it left the mind of Ati separated from the power and unable to control it, just like the power of Preservation was. So then what did the prison do? Did it bind the power of Ruin so that it couldn't act? No, because it still had the world in its grip. It simply removed the will of the vessel. So if it was free to act, why didn't it just instinctively reach out and ruin the entire planet? Well, let's check in with Scadrial at this point. Initially, we had 2 full shards, completely directed by total vessels. Now we have 2 equally weakened shards, both of them without very much in the way of direction. So just like at the start, they were once again perfectly in balance, as all things should be, and unable to affect the world greatly on their own. So that's why Leras' plan could have worked. Unfortunately, that's the idealized version, the sphere of uniform mass on a frictionless plane version of it, if you will. In reality, life was a little bit messier than that. Because the prison wasn't complete, Ati was able to influence his power in little ways, getting to do things that Preservation wouldn't immediately push back against, or reach out to people who were spiked by hemalurgy, something that he had an advantage over Preservation anyway. And likewise, there were still a few instructions left with the power of Preservation, which itself manifested as the mists spread across the land. The power could grow at the well over 1,000 years, a place that mortals had access to. Now, it's never really explained, at least not that I can see, why exactly Ruin doesn't prevent people from using the power at the well. Maybe it's that little bits of it were saved time after time until finally it was one big push that Ruin couldn't hold back. Maybe Ruin, the mind of Ruin Ati, held back the power and let it happen because he thought it was in his own best interest somehow. We're not really sure, but one way or another we know that it did happen. Because here's the thing, this was Leras' final gambit. He knew he could set things up in a way that Ruin would have to let things play out with a hero showing up to take the power, because that's the only way Ati can ever be free. Without that, he'd be trapped in his prison forever, unable to affect the world and unable to destroy it. Since he knew the only key was someone taking the power and giving it up, he had to risk someone taking the power and using it. And Ati's patience finally paid off. eventually then showed up and did exactly what he wanted and released him. We'll get into the specifics of that, but first, let's talk about what preservation could do on its own, undirected all that time. When the well was full, or at least close to full, or when Ati's prison was gone, the extra power went into the mists. The same way that Ati's power is able to have an advantage when trying to contact someone who has hemalurgic spikes, Preservation's power had an advantage when reaching out to people with genetic potential to become Allomancers, Preservation's own arcana. It could snap people if they had the potential to become Allomancers, or even if they didn't quite have enough, it could grant them a gift of power to get them over that threshold. Now, Ruin either didn't or couldn't stop this. It's a little muddled by the fact that we know towards the end, Ruin was actively trying to help it. Now, whether that means just pulling back his power and letting Preservation doing its thing, or somehow actually reaching out and helping it, he was able to make snapping worse so that people would be attacked by the mists and think that they were being harmed instead of understanding that it was trying to give them power, because he was making it way worse than it had to be. Let's get back to freeing Ati. What exactly did Vin do? She took the power, released it, and somehow that undid the prison. I don't think this part has ever been completely explained. If any students have any suggestions, put them in the comments section down below. I have two ideas for what it might have been. One of them could have been that when she released the power, when she let it go, since the prison around Ati's mind was made of that same power, or at least a mind suffused with that power, it was also released at the same time and went free. Another thing is that Leras could have simply left very specific instructions that when someone takes the power and lets it go, this is what you do. One thing that throws me off is, in Secret History, we see from Kelsier's experience what he is seeing. He says that he sees the power forming a spear which falls down and cuts a hole in reality that Ati crawls out of. I'm not sure what that means. It doesn't really seem to match with the other things that we know have happened. So it's possible that that was just like a metaphor his mind was making up to explain something that he couldn't really understand, like when he looks into the spiritual realm. Again, if anyone has any ideas what that could mean, feel free to explain your ideas in the comment section down below. And there you have it. That is my lecture on Ruin's Prison. Hopefully it didn't feel too much like a prison yourself. Don't forget to comment and subscribe. Don't forget to like the video. If you're on mobile, you can go ahead and hype it. Next month, I will be doing a deep dive into one of the fundamental forces of the Cosmere, so if that sounds tantalizing, make sure you show back up. Class dismissed.